All right. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with everyone this evening. Thank you, Dr. Fike, Dr. Pent, for giving me the platform to share some of my research that I'm working on for my dissertation. As Dr. Fike mentioned, I'm Adam Murray, a third-year PhD student out of Virginia Tech. I'm focusing on how live animal management throughout the entire life cycle can affect ending carcass characteristics and meat quality. So kind of a meat scientist at heart and mixing it with the live side, trying to get the best of both worlds. So just to give a little background on this project, I'll be presenting the first year's worth of data. Year two is ongoing right now. How we thought up of this project and what questions we want to answer, as I'm sure everyone knows that's followed any more or less amount of the beef industry in the past 2 decades. Hot carcass weights are getting higher and higher every year. And with that, our frame size on feeder calves and is increasing as well. We want to have as much skeleton as possible to be able to push more pounds on traditionally, feedlot grain finished animals, because it's more profitable and more economic for beef producers and cattle finishers. So these USDA standards were last updated probably about 10-15 years ago. So they're a little out of date, but it's pretty much what everyone still uses. The USDA will put the medium to average size animal, your average feeder calf, at a frame score of 4 to 5.5 on that scale of 1 to 9. And what that means is they have a good chance to grade choice or higher at a live weight of 1,100 to 1,250 pounds. As I'm sure anyone knows in the industry nowadays, you'd be hard pressed to find 1,100, 1,200 pound, that generic feeder steer or finished fat steer or fat heifer. Realistically, we're closer to 1,350 to 1,400 pounds of live weight in our traditionally fed beef. So what this has done is discounted the smaller frame feeder cattle at our sale barns, especially here on the East Coast, with Virginia being more of a cow-calf producing or backgrounding state, as opposed to the Midwest and the Corn Belt, where we get more of our finishing experience. So it's been mentioned before throughout these presentations. We're very well situated with our climate and to support nearly year-round grazing. If you manage well, as these previous producers have showed, if you manage your pasture and your resources, you can get year-round grazing with these cool season dominated pastures. At the same time, especially in Virginia, we're located pretty closely to some of these niche markets around the higher population dense areas, where we're seeing some premiums, especially in the last 5 to 10 years. We're seeing some premiums put on grass finished beef, where consumers are making their voice heard, through the pocketbook, as it will. So a combination of these smaller framed feeder calves getting discounted at sale barns and the opportunity to take advantage of some premium markets, we thought this might be an alternative marketing avenue for producers to sell some of their cattle through, that might not make it or might not fare as well on the traditional the traditional feedlot program, shipping them out west. One of the big issues, or I guess questions, that's been brought up in these past few presentations as well, is where do we finish our grass-fed beef? Traditionally, for grain-fed feedlot beef, commodity beef, we're looking for, like I mentioned, that 1,350 to 1,400 pounds of live weight and a back fat measure of about a half an inch or greater on that 12th to 13th rib back fat. You see here on the left, there's a picture of a grain-fed finished carcass on the left and a grass-fed carcass on the right. Because corn is naturally more energy dense compared to forage, we're going to get these faster growth rates. We're going to get more fat deposited, and larger carcasses compared to grass-fed. Now, if we were to feed grass-finished beef, purely grass beef, out to these same live characteristics that we expect from conventionally raised beef, that's going to push the age up to 2.5 years, sometimes even more, maybe on your more poorly managed systems. And what happens as these cattle get older, you see here on the right, I have a electron microscope picture of the connective tissue. This is actually the connective tissue surrounding the individual muscle fibers in a cut of meat. And as these cattle age naturally, the collagen in the connective tissue is going to have more cross linkages and more tighter bonds. So this is going to make inherently more tough or inherently less tender beef as cattle get older, which is why we usually want to harvest them before that 2 years of age. So we have a bit of a balancing act. Do you finish grass-fed beef on a timeline basis, so you harvest them before 2 years of age and maybe sacrifice a little bit of added marbling and a little bit more carcass weight, or do you finish them at our traditional indicators of what a finished animal is, that 1,300 pounds, half inch of back fat, and sacrifice some of your physiological decreases in tenderness due to age. So, a couple factors kind of playing together. How we decided to plan out this project, it was a coordinated effort between the commercial herd at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg and the Southern Piedmont Research Station in Blackstone there in Southeast Virginia. The cattle came from the commercial herd and were sent to Blackstone at about 15 to 16 months of age when this project and the data collection actually began. These cattle were selectively bred, so we took hip heights and frame scores on the commercial cow herd and bred them to a couple different Angus bulls that we selected based on mature height, on top of some other growth characteristics. But we wanted to get two divergent lines to have a large frame and a small frame group. So we ended up with these cattle are mainly 3/4 Angus, 1/4 Simmental, and we got not only our divergent frame groups, we also wanted to, especially with the USDA and FSIS and about 2014, 2015, they retracted some of their definitions of what grass-fed and grass-finished beef are. So it leaves a lot more flexibility for producers on, in terms of supplementation versus pure forage-raised beef. You see here on the right, we found this product. It was graciously donated by the Jeffo Feed Company. It is a rumen-protected fat. So that is, those prills there on the right are no bigger than grains of sand. And it's vegetable oils that a combination of the size, and also there's a coating around each of those. The fat will bypass the rumen and actually get digested in the small intestine. And why that's important is we usually don't want to feed more than about 5% of DMI of the ration of fat, because as fat increases above that 5% level, not only does it decrease forage digestibility and fiber digestibility by coating the fibers to prevent the microbes in the rumen from being able to digest, it also, the fat acts as a detergent in a way and kills off some of that beneficial rumen microbe population. So really on two fronts, that's the issue. With this rumen protected fat, we get the benefits of an energy dense supplement without the negative effects on rumen microbe health. So the reason we use this rumen bypass fat, we used it in a combination, as you can see here, supplemented 6% of dry matter intake for the cattle based off weight. This rumen protected fat was supplemented with some dry molasses and a little bit of corn gluten feed just for palatability. And this was provided daily. This package throughout the entire year one experiment was less than 5 pounds of per head per day, excuse me. And we thought that this kind of stayed more true, I guess, to the grass-fed beef definition. While they weren't on solely grass and forage, they weren't on a starch-based diet. So this ended up with, between the availability, excuse me, of supplement that we used, Kalen Gates and Pastures, and the two frame groups, we ended up with 5 groups overall. And this is the nomenclature I'm going to be using for the rest of the presentation. At the bottom, you see S for small frame, S sup for small frame supplemented, L for large frame, and L sup for large frame supplemented. These four groups were on pasture for the entirety of the experiment until they were harvested. And the two groups, S sup and L sup, had access to Kalin gates, so we could track their intake of this supplement that we provided every day. We then also did a positive control where these cattle, the remaining cattle, were on a dirt lot on a traditionally corn-based diet, and we wanted to show that these cattle had the genetics to be able to behave and perform like traditionally raised cattle, and any of these differences that we'd see between supplemented and non-supplemented, on the pasture groups would be from from either the frame score or the supplementation package, and not due to genetics. So we followed these cattle with your traditional live measurements. Started with the 2-day average. Every 3 to 4 weeks, I would go out and get weights on the cattle to update the supplementation level for both the pasture cattle and the feedlot cattle. And I also followed the hip heights to track frame scores throughout this experiment. I did monthly ultrasound measurements for 12th rib back fat, and also as a really good indicator or a really good prediction of how much forage they were eating daily, we did 2 runs of a titanium dioxide indigestible marker. I'll get into that towards the end of this presentation. We also took weekly forage mass measurements, monthly nutrient analysis to see what kind of feed stuff they were getting or feed value they were getting from that pasture. And then also we followed these cattle to harvest to get your traditional measurements of quality and yield grade, but also on the carcasses, I got lean and fat colored using a colorimeter, a scanner. I'll get into that a little bit later as well. We did a Warner-Bratzler shear force test. So what happened from each carcass, I collected half of a ribeye, cut those into steaks, cooked those steaks uniformly, and this Warner-Bratzler shear force, I have some pictures later, is a objective measure of tenderness. So this is a way to get some palatability data objectively without running a whole consumer taste panel. And like I mentioned, I had pictures on that later. And I also had this T-bars assay. So one of the, questions that I'm sure y'all hear a lot for consumers eating pasture finished beef for the first time, they see the more yellow fat. Sometimes you get some different aromas from what they're used to with grain finished traditional beef. That's because of the higher amount of unsaturated fatty acids in the diet that is actually changing the type of fat that's deposited in those carcasses. So one question that's raised with an increased level of unsaturated fatty acids is lipid oxidation. We can get some off flavors, some off aromas that are unfavorable to consumers. So there's an assay that I plan on doing with these steaks as well to get a measure of that and a measure of shelf life as well. So getting into the data, you can see our picture on the right. This is how we measured our frame score, right over the hooks in front of the tailhead. This is basically just showing our selective breeding worked. Our small frame cattle stayed smaller. Our large frame cattle stayed larger throughout the entirety of this experiment, and the control feedlot group was somewhere in the middle. So these cattle started off with hip heights of between 46 and 50 inches. And this would be in the beginning of July when year 1 started last year. And these cattle were harvested at the beginning of November, and they maintained that 4-inch spread. They ended with hip heights between 48 and 52 inches. Getting into some of the forage mass data, as I'm sure some of the South Side producers know, last year towards the end of summer into the fall, we had a hellacious drought. I have the precipitation, the rain numbers there on the right. For whatever reason, National Weather Service has not updated past September of last year. But you see those averages, you usually expect 4 to 4.5 inches a month. We were well below that in September, and I can say from experience that trend continued into October and November. So we had some really, really dry and hotter weather than usual So we tried to rotate these cattle as much as possible. The goal was to make sure that forage mass was never limiting. But towards the end, especially towards, as I mentioned, August, September, that drought really started to hit us hard, and the pastures we planned on using were not getting any regrowth that we expected. So here to the far right of this graph, you'll see the forage mass jumps up a bunch. We were actually able to utilize some silvo pastures there, but throughout the entire experiment, the cattle were on novel endophyte infected fescue. So fescue toxicosis was not an issue throughout this experiment. As to be expected, the grain-fed control cattle on that higher plane of energy had a larger average daily gain. We expect with the year two data coming in, we're going to harvest this year's cattle the middle of October to see potentially some changes within the pasture groups once we get more numbers to this data. But statistically, only the control group was different. This trend continued in our backfat ultrasound. Again, just that higher energy level in the corn-based diet. It's what we expect to see. And then all the pasture cattle stayed pretty tight throughout the entirety of the experiment. Getting into some of the carcass data, you can see at the very top are columns: hot carcass weight, fat thickness, ribeye area, yield grade, marbling, dressing percent, and Warner-Bratzler shear force. And all of those except for Warner-Bratzler shear force, the feedlot control group is going to be statistically different than the pasture groups, which is again to be expected from their diet. But one thing I would like to point out was that from the Warner-Bratzler shear force, so that machine is in the bottom left. We basically, like I mentioned, cook the steaks uniformly, and then that machine measures the force it takes to cut through that core of meat. That was not statistically different, meaning the more force it would take to cut through that steak would mean less tender product, more chewing. But this showed that, due to a focus on carcass quality and tenderness throughout the past couple decades, that even though we had these big these differences in diet, we still had uniformly tender and acceptable beef. I expect these numbers to, tease out a little bit more again as we get more data at the end of this year. So moving forward, with the timing of this project year one ending at the beginning of November, we hit the holidays and then went right into the COVID quarantine, and that shut down all our labs. So some more, the titanium dioxide, the measure of forage intake, that lipid oxidation, we are just able to get back in the lab and get some of that data. So I will be working on that to get some of that data shortly. And I'm still teasing through some of the objective color measures. As you can imagine, color is a very subjective thing, so it's hard to put a number to what people would call a color. And while I have some objective numbers, I need to be able to put them in a context of, say, okay, you're measuring redness in a steak. What does a measure of 15 versus 16 mean? Can the consumer tell that difference? I'm working through that to be able to interpret that data a little more clearly. Like I mentioned,
Adam?
Yes, sir.
I'm very thankful for all the work that you're doing. I'm also feeling some pressure, conscious of time, and I'm sorry to try to shepherd you off the stage, but what I'd like you to do is take us to the conclusions, summary, take-home message slide, if that's okay.
Yep, I was actually, that's my next one. So I was going to say thank you to the field crew and everyone that's helped me. The conclusions as of right now, we really just need to get this year two data. We have 42 head of cattle on year two coming in, and while we see some trends or hints of trends, favoring the supplemented cattle on pasture versus just the regular pasture cattle, we need a little more data to be able to tease them out and see if it's anecdotal or kind of how we can put the economics of this. We've been collecting all of our receipts and returns on this to see if the economics really pan out. Stay tuned for year two data to really make some conclusive impact on this.